Afternoon session 12 p.m.
The court said, "Please bring the jurors in."
The law clerk said, "Jury entering."
Jury present.
The court said, "Remember, sir, that you're under oath. You may continue the inquiry."
Mr. Horton said, "Thank you, Your Honor."
By Mr. Horton.
Mr. Brown. Before the break you were discussing your understanding of the cryptocurrency and exchange project you were hired for. What did you understand about whether the coins you were hired to work on would be on a public blockchain or a private blockchain?
I understood that they would be on a public blockchain.
What, if anything, did you understand the role? Before the break you mentioned something called quorum. Can you remind the jury what quorum is?
Quorum is a JP Morgan open-source blockchain that is an enterprise chain for Ethereum.
Is Quorum a public blockchain or a private blockchain?
It's a private blockchain.
And when you were hired to work on the cryptocurrency project for GTV, what understanding, if any, did you have about the role that the Quorum blockchain would have in this project?
I understood that it would be the chain that the coins would be distributed on and transferred and traded on.
Now, Mr. Brown, in your 2.5 years with the Himalaya exchange, when, if ever, could customers buy H-coin on a blockchain?
Never.
And when, if ever, could customers buy H-dollar on a blockchain?
Never.
Was that what you were expecting when you took this job in 2020?
Mr. Skirrick said, "Objection," asked and answered.
The court said, "Overruled. You may answer."
It was not.
What were you expecting about the type of coin you developed?
I was expecting something that would be built on top of the Quorum chain and something that would be what a typical crypto would be. Mr. Skirrick said, "Objection."
The court said, "Are you saying what you expected it to be?"
The witness said, yes.
The court said, "Go ahead."
You said you were expecting it to be what a typical crypto would be. How is what you actually observed at the exchange different from what you'd expected typical crypto to be?
The exchange used just a database. It wasn't a blockchain.
And what was the database you're talking about? What does that mean?
Well, a database is a typical tech tool where data is stored and accessed by computers.
And what was the name of the database that the Himalaya exchange was using?
It was Postgres, I believe.
Can you spell that?
POSGREST, I believe.
And this database, how does it compare to a spreadsheet?
It's typical to a spreadsheet, only it would allow not only structured data, but unstructured data.
Was this database on the blockchain?
It was not.
Where was it if it wasn't on the blockchain?
It was controlled by the exchange and the technology team there.
As CEO of the exchange, did you have access to this internal database?
I did not.
Why not?
I wasn't allowed access to any of the technology that they were building in London.
What do you mean that you weren't allowed access to any of the technology that the exchange was building?
There was only a small group of people in London that had access for security reasons.
Did you ever ask William J.E. why you didn't have access to the exchange's internal database as its CEO?
I did not.
Why not?
I just felt as though the chief security officer and the chief operations officer were the ones really managing that.
If customer couldn't buy H-coin on the blockchain, what could they buy from the exchange?
They could buy credits.
And when you were hired to work on this GTV cryptocurrency project, were you told about credits then?
No, I was not.
What were credits at the Himalaya exchange?
Credits were when people would join the exchange. They would buy certain credits with US dollar that they had deposited into their accounts, and then they would receive credits for the crypto.
And what were the name of the credits at the Himalaya exchange?
The names of the credits, could you repeat that?
Sure. What were the names of the credits that people could buy at the Himalaya exchange? What were they called?
Himalaya dollar and Himalaya coin.
And were Himalaya dollar credits and Himalaya coin credits the same or different from Himalaya dollar and Himalaya coin?
They were different.
How were they different?
The Himalaya dollar was a stable coin which was backed. For every Himalaya dollar, it was to be backed by a US dollar in a bank account.
And how was the Himalaya dollar credit different from the Himalaya dollar stable coin?
It was not.
It was not the same, you said?
No, it was the same.
It was the same?
Yes.
When somebody bought a Himalaya dollar credit, were they actually buying a Himalaya dollar?
They were buying credits to the dollar, not the actual dollar itself.
And where were these credits, Himalaya dollar credit, Himalaya coin credit, where were they stored?
They would have been stored on the database, I believe.
Could customers buy Himalaya coin credits and Himalaya dollar credits on the blockchain?
They could not.
In your understanding at the time as the CEO of the exchange, were these credits cryptocurrency?
No, they were not. Mr. Skirek said, "Objection, Your Honor."
The court said, "Overruled."
In your understanding, Mr. Brown, at the time as the CEO of the Himalaya exchange, were these credits cryptocurrencies?
Mr. Skirek said, "Same objection."
The court said, "He answered that question."
Mr. Horton said, "I'm sorry, Your Honor. I wasn't sure if the jury heard the answer."
Could you repeat it?
The court said no. He answered the question. He did.
Who did you first hear about the credits from?
I first heard about the credits from William J.E. in a team meeting.
And, Mr. Brown, what did William J.E. say about the credits in this meeting?
He spoke to them as if they were like an amusement park credits where you pay for tickets and cash them out when you left the park.
What did you think when you heard William J.E. describe the credits that way?
Somewhat amusing.
What was amusing about it to you?
It just kind of flies in the face of a cryptocurrency, right? Mr. Skirek said, "Objection, Your Honor."
The court said, "Overruled. You may continue."
Mr. Brown, what do you mean that the credits at the Himalaya exchange fly in the face of a cryptocurrency?
Well, what cryptocurrency is about? It's about a public chain where transactions are viewed to for everyone. And everything that goes on that chain people have access to. This wasn't anything like that.
Why weren't the credits anything like that?
Mr. Skirek said, "Same objection."
The court said, "Sir, you're speaking based upon your personal understanding. Is that correct?"
The witness said, yes.
The court said, "Go ahead."
Mr. Brown, why as the former CEO of the Himalaya exchange, why in your view, why in your understanding? Were the credits at the exchange nothing like the cryptocurrencies you've just described?
Because the credits were obfuscated. They weren't public knowledge like a public blockchain or like a private chain would be for all the consortium members.
You said earlier that you helped draft white papers at the exchange?
Yes.
Where were these white papers published?
They were published on the Himalaya Exchange website.
Were they available for the public?
They were.
Did these white papers discuss HCN and HDO credits?
Yes, they did.
Did you ask William J.E. questions about why the exchange was using credits instead of cryptocurrencies on the blockchain?
Yes, I did.
What did you ask him?
I asked him why we were using this model as opposed to just issuing the coins on the chain.
And what did William J.E. say when you asked him why the exchange wasn't issuing credits on the blockchain?
At that point we were looking for a place to issue the coin, and the British Virgin Islands was a jurisdiction that they picked. And that at this point legal counsel in the British Virgin Islands suggested this.
Mr. Brown, you were at the exchange for 2.5 years. At any time during your time there were H-coin and H-dollar able to be bought or sold on the blockchain?
Mr. Skirek said, "Objection."
The court said, "Asked and answered. You don't need to answer."
Mr. Brown, if you thought that these credits were not cryptocurrencies, why didn't you leave your job?
Mr. Skirek said, "Objection."
The court said, "You may answer."
I kept my job for my paycheck.
When you worked at the exchange at that time, did you believe it was a legitimate business?
Yes. Yes.
Did you believe you were committing crimes when you worked there?
I didn't, no.
And remind the jury, when did you leave the exchange?
January of 2023.
By the way, Mr. Brown, was G Club a client of the Himalaya exchange when you were there?
They were.
And what did G Club use the exchange for?
I believe it was for the money transfer for the purchase of the G Club memberships.
And did you understand what that meant at the time?
I did not.
Did you ask William J. what it meant?
I did not.
In general, Mr. Brown, what was your understanding of how William J. treated your views and opinions?
You know, I think because I was in Florida. I wasn't able to get in his ear as much as a lot of the people in London were. So most of my concepts or strategies or ideas never really made it to fruition.
And how, if at all, did that affect your experience being the CEO of the exchange that William J. that your ideas didn't take fruition?
Mr. Skirrick said, object to form.
The court said you may answer.
I just felt like I was kind of a strawman, like the face of the company. I didn't really have any say in anything that went on.
Why did you feel like a strawman? What do you mean by that?
Mr. Skirrick said, asked and answered.
The court said, you may explain what strawman means.
Strawman is someone who they don't really have any say in the decision-making, right? They're just kind of the face of it but don't really have any input into the decisions.
What understanding, if any, Mr. Brown, did you have about why the exchange wanted you to be its face?
I think part of it was I was willing to move to the BVI. And I think part of it too was my experience at DTCC and at Ford working with blockchain there.
And did you feel like you were able to bring that experience to bear when you were working at the exchange?
Not at all.
You said you were willing to move to the BVI, did you ultimately move there?
I never did make it there.
Did you spend time at the BVI for the exchange?
I did.
And what were you doing there for the exchange?
Part of the time was spent seeking out an office space. Other time was spent talking to telecom providers about a potential data room. And then other times I was working with a sandbox application there as well.
And did the exchange ever get a property in the BVI?
We did not.
Did it ever get a data room in the BVI?
It did not.
What happened to the sandbox application?
Denied.
What is a sandbox application?
A sandbox application is an application where you apply for an exchange license. But you're placed in a sandbox kind of as a test period to see if everything will be compliant and everything you do with your company will meet their guidelines.
Was that the application that was denied?
That was.
How many hours a day were you working on exchange projects down in the BVI?
Probably about 3 or 4 hours.
How did that compare to the amount of day you were spending on exchange work back in Florida?
It was about the same.
Did you like being in the BVI?
I did.
Other than 3 hours a day working for the exchange, what did you do down there?
I surfed.
What was your title when you were hired in 2020, Mr. Brown?
Associate Blockchain Manager, I believe.
Did there come a time that you sought out the title of CEO?
No.
How did you find out you'd been named the CEO?
During one of our stakeholder meetings, William appointed me CEO.
Before that happened in the meeting, did you know it was going to happen?
I did not.
Was it on the agenda for that meeting?
It was not.
What was your reaction when you heard William say that you were their CEO?
I was pretty surprised.
Why were you surprised?
I don't consider myself CEO material.
Why do you mean by that? Why aren't you CEO material?
Well, I'm a terrible public speaker. I don't really understand all the dynamics that go with being a chief executive. I'm a tech guy.
Had you ever been a CEO before that?
I had not.
Did you ever lead an organization?
No.
Mr. Brown, what, if anything, about the work you were doing changed after you were named CEO?
I guess I was involved more in the marketing side.
What did that entail, being involved in more of the exchange's marketing side?
It meant doing some video sessions and doing some interviews that were given to me by the marketing team.
What do you mean that interviews were given to you by the marketing team?
They would decide who I would talk to and when. They would set the agendas.
And what kinds of things would you talk about in these interviews?
Talk about the exchange, the coin, technologies that were used.
Did you have an understanding of why the exchange wanted you to do public interviews?
No. Like I said, I'm terrible at them.
Did you ever ask William J.E. why you're asking me to do this?
No, I just considered it something that I had to do.
Mr. Brown, what, if anything, happened with the exchange in November 2021?
That's when we had the official launch.
What do you mean by the official launch?
The exchange, prior to the launch. There was a private sale for the HCN coins or for the H-dollar coins. People were topped up to buy H-dollar. And then when the exchange launched would be the first time people could buy these coins.
The private sale you referred to, were people buying H-coins or H-coin credits?
They were buying H-coin credits.
Were they buying H-dollars or H-dollar credits?
They were buying H-dollar credits.
When you say building up to the launch, what do you mean building up to the launch?
There was a pre-sale where a $100 million was raised before the launch of the exchange.
What was the date of the launch?
November 1, 2021.
What's your understanding of why that date was chosen for the launch?
My understanding was, it was a drop-dead day issued by Gov't.
How do you have that understanding?
Well, we had really struggled to launch the exchange. It was scheduled to launch several times previously in the previous months, and every time we failed. And there was a time where that was it. We had to launch the exchange on November 1st come hell or high water.
Did Gov't have a title at the exchange?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did he participate in those daily video meetings with William J.E.?
No.
What is your understanding of how that drop-dead launch date came from Gov't?
It was from some conversation that I had after with some team members and then also. Mr. Skirek said, objection to the hearsay.
The court said, overruled. You may continue.
Mr. Brown. The question was, how do you have the understanding that Gov't gave you instruction for the exchange to launch on November of 2021?
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, can we have a brief sidebar on this, please?
The court said, all right.
Continued on next page. At the sidebar.
The court said, Mr. Horton, do you expect that he is going to say that the people he was speaking with were part of the alleged conspiracy?
Mr. Horton said, yes. What he's going to say is that what the people working with William J.E. at the Himalaya exchange telling him what the exchange is doing for Gov't.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, the question is, how far does this co-conspirator exception goes? And to what extent does the government have to build up? As we understood the court's opinion to require specific statements from specific people that can be relayed as hearsay under the exception. Right now, we don't even know who he's talking about. He's just talking about people at the exchange, right? So is every person. We understood the court's ruling pretrial to be that there was no blanket exception under which hearsay would be permitted. Just because someone used, of the various entities here, had conversation with witnesses. And right now that's where we're at.
Mr. Horton said, Your Honor, there is now in evidence minutes if not hours of the defendant talking about G-dollar, G-coin. H-dollar, H-coin, the exchange, video of him saying that. William J.E.'s testimony. William J.E. was running that project. He's charged as a co-conspirator. The information Mr. Brown was getting was from people who worked directly for William J.E. at the Himalaya exchange, which is instrumentality in this RICO conspiracy, telling him what was going on.
Mr. Skirek said, There's a difference, Your Honor, between saying that William J.E. said something that this witness will identify and saying unidentified views of people who worked for Mr. J.E.
Mr. Horton said, there's a co-conspirator exception. There's also an agent exception. They work together. He's the principal and he's speaking on behalf of a co-conspirator. That comes in.
The court said, all right. I'm going to let it in. I've ruled.
Continued on next page. In open court, jury present.
The court said, overruled. You may continue.
By Mr. Horton.
Mr. Brown. The question was, how did you understand that it was Gov't who gave the instruction for the exchange to launch on November 1, 2021?
After having some conversations with some colleagues after the launch and then also during the launch. GTV had a big presentation going on at the time.
And what role, if any, did you have in GTV's presentation on the launch day of the Himalaya exchange?
I was to speak live as soon as the exchange was launched.
And where did you get that assignment from?
I got that assignment from William J.E.
We'll come back to that in a second. Were you CEO on the day of the launch?
Yes.
Were you CEO in the days running up to the launch?
Yes.
In your view, was the exchange ready to launch?
It was not.
Why was it not ready to launch?
We had struggled so long with the technology. I had a lot of talks with the technology leaders and they felt the same way.
And you said struggle with the technology, what does that mean?
It means we weren't able to deliver on time. At the time there was the pandemic. It was hard to get really talented blockchain developers. And we just really didn't have the skill set or the means to deliver on time.
What time on November 1, 2021, was the exchange supposed to launch?
I believe it was 9 or 10 in the morning.
And what time did it launch?
11 at night.
And why is that?
Because it wasn't ready. And from my understanding from conversations, one developer kind of put together the exchange quickly in that time to launch.
How did that happen? How did it happen that one developer put the exchange together quickly?
He was just kind of like the top Superman developer I guess that was there, and he took matters into his own hands.
Mr. Brown, after the exchange launched that day, at this point were customers able to buy H-coin on the blockchain?
No.
Were customers able after the launch to buy H-dollar on the blockchain?
No. Mr. Skirek said, objection, asked and answered.
The court said, overruled. You may answer.
No.
You said that there was a long broadcast on GTV on launch day. Did you participate in it?
Yes.
And where did you film your interview from?
My office in Florida.
The people interviewing you on GTV, do you know where they were broadcasting from?
I do not.
What were you? Can you sort of walk the jury through that day? What was it like for you?
Well, it was stressful. I was supposed to talk at 10. I'm not great at public speaking. So I was a little nervous. I didn't think the tech would be ready. And then it just dragged on for hours and hours and hours, which led to more anxiety.
And what specifically were you asked to do on GTV that day, launch day?
I believe just to be interviewed.
Ms. Loftus, can you please pull up what's been marked as GX3401, just for the witness, please? Then with the sound off, Ms. Loftus, if you could please scroll through it for the witness, please. Mr. Brown. What is this?
This would be my interview during the launch day.
Mr. Horton said, government offers GX3401.
Mr. Skirek said, no objection.
The court said, it is admitted.
Government's Exhibit 3401 received in evidence.
Can you please publish this, Ms. Loftus? And if you could take it to the 1 minute and 45-second mark and play that with sound for the room.
Media played.
Mr. Brown, you said we suffered some delays, but we wanted to make sure we did it right. And I think we have. Do you think the exchange had gotten it right that day?
No.
Why did you say that on GTV?
For fear of disrupting the whole launch.
Ms. Loftus, can we go to the 2:45 mark, please?
Media played.
Mr. Brown. The question you were asked was, what are the advantages of H-coin compared to other crypto like Bitcoin? When you were asked that question on GTV, was H-coin a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin?
Mr. Skirek said, objection, asked and answered.
The court said, overruled. You may answer.
It was not.
Why not?
It wasn't on the blockchain.
In your answer on the video, you said we have this permission chain that we use. What were you referring to by permission chain?
Quorum.
And were customers able to buy H-coin or H-dollar using quorum on the date of this interview?
They were not.
Were your answers in this interview truthful, Mr. Brown?
They were not.
Why did you lie in these interviews?
Again, I was fearful of causing a major sell-off during the launch of the coin. And I was kind of towing the company line on what to say during these events.
And what do you mean by the company line?
Well, there were certain talk points that, we were to discuss at all times. And one of those was the quorum chain.
And where did you get your understanding of what the talking points were to be?
That would have been from the legal team and from the marketing team as well.
And legal and marketing at the exchange, who did they report to?
William J.E.
Mr. Brown. Was this November 2021 GTV interview the only time you gave an interview in public on behalf of the exchange?
It was not.
In those other interviews, did you say things about the exchange and its coins that were not true?
I did.
And what are the things that you lied about in these other interviews?
Really constantly talking about the coin being on the blockchain and us using quorum.
You said a moment ago that you were fearful of causing a sell-off?
Yes.
What is a sell-off?
Well, a sell-off is when there's fear in the marketplace and people rush to sell their currencies.
And what effect, if any, would a sell-off have on the price of H-coin?
It would drop the price.
What happened to H-coin's price on the day of the launch?
It popped.
What does that mean that it popped?
It went from 10 cents to $1 while I was interviewing, and it later went to $20 in 14 days.
And as the CEO of the exchange at the time, what was your understanding of, well, let me ask you this. What was your reaction of seeing that price hike?
Kind of amazed.
And why is that?
It was kind of a giant leap for a coin that was really only on a small exchange. It wasn't on any big exchanges.
And what do you mean that the coin wasn't on any big exchanges?
Well, typically when you launch a coin, 2 exchanges will pick you up. And when that happens and the coin is kind of broadcast on a lot of sites that rank coins and show prices like the Nasdaq does. So, we weren't anything like that. So the awareness for our coin globally didn't exist.
When the H-coin price was rising the way you explain, Mr. Brown. At this time were customers able to hold an H-coin or were they able to hold an H-coin credit?
Mr. Skirrick said, objection.
The court said you may answer.
Mr. Skirrick said, over and over. Credits.
Did you ever ask William J.E. if there's an explanation for the price hike?
No.
Was H-coin ever listed on other exchanges other than the Himalaya exchange?
It was not.
What about H-dollar?
No.
And as the CEO at the time, what was your understanding of why H-coin and H-dollar weren't listed anywhere except the Himalaya exchange?
There was quite a bit of fear among the stakeholders that if it was listed on other exchanges, the price would drop.
And who were the stakeholders who had this fear about a price drop?
Pretty much all of them, but the chief security officer, the legal team and the chief operations officer.
What was your understanding of why listing H-coin and H-dollar on other exchanges could cause a price drop?
Well, because it would allow a free market to participate in a much broader scale. So more people could come in and it would give the people who owned the coin more liquidity to sell.
And why didn't the exchange want that?
Mr. Skirrick said, objection.
The court said by the word exchange. Why didn't the exchange want that? Who are you referring to?
Mr. Brown, you were the CEO at the time?
Yes.
What was your understanding why stakeholders at the exchange didn't want the coins or the dollar to be listed on another exchange?
For fear that the price would drop.
What is Hummingbot? Do you know what that is?
Yes.
Can you spell it, please?
Hummingbot.
What is Hummingbot?
It's a software that trades takes both sides of a trade. It will buy and sell autonomously.
Was Hummingbot used at the Himalaya exchange?
It was.
And how did you know that?
It was spoken about in several meetings.
And who told you that Hummingbot was being used at the exchange?
That would be David Fallon.
Who is David Fallon?
He was the fund manager for Hamilton Fund.
Who did David Fallon work for?
William J.E.
What's your understanding as the CEO of the exchange why Hummingbot was being used on the exchange?
There were primarily two purposes. One was a bot is typically used in a low-volume scenario where there aren't a lot of traders. That does not bode well for other investors because they don't want to see a ghost town. So these bots automatically trade to give the impression of activity.
Why are they called bots?
Because they're automated. There's no human behind them. It's just software.
You said a low-volume scenario?
Yes.
What does that mean?
A low-volume scenario means there's not a lot of trades. Typically an exchange will trade in the millions every day.
At the time did you observe a low-volume scenario at the Himalaya exchange?
Yes. It got gradually worse after the launch.
And as the volume got gradually worse, what, if anything, was happening to the price?
The price remained stable for the most part.
What was your understanding of how that was?
My understanding was that the bot was driving a lot of the trades and propping the price.
Did you ever ask William J.E. about the Hummingbot?
I did not.
Why not?
That was a David Fallon fun task.
Mr. Brown, did there come a time you learned anything about GTV and the SEC?
There did.
And were you CEO at the time you learned this information?
I was.
What did you learn? First of all, what's the SEC?
The Securities Exchange Commission.
And what did you learn when you were CEO of the Himalaya Exchange about GTV and the SEC?
I learned that they entered into a settlement with the SEC. And part of the SEC stated that Miles Guo was not to participate in any crypto or security issuances directly or indirectly.
As CEO of the Himalaya Exchange, why did you learn that information?
I typically read some of the SEC filings because at that point there was a lot going on with FTX and their collapse. And basically to understand compliance moving forward because compliance is a very difficult thing in this field. So you kind of have to get a feel for the industry.
What, if anything, did you do when you learned that there was a GTV settlement with the SEC about cryptocurrency?
I raised it in one of the meetings.
Mr. Brown, was this a Himalaya Exchange meeting?
Yes, it was.
Why did you raise GTV's settlement with the SEC in a Himalaya Exchange meeting?
Because there was a lot of marketing being done by Miles Guo at that time around the exchange. And I felt that that was indirectly being involved.
What do you mean marketing being done by Miles Guo around the exchange?
He spoke about the exchange a lot on his platforms. He created an iTunes song about HCN to the moon.
Did you hear that song?
I did.
Before the Himalaya Exchange, had you worked in blockchain?
I had.
What, if anything, did the title HCN to the moon mean to you?
Well, to the moon is a crypto saying that everyone wants to invest in a coin and then it skyrockets in price to the moon.
Mr. Brown, what was your understanding about why Miles Guo was making a song called H-Coin to the moon?
Mr. Skirrick said, objection.
The court said you may answer.
I don't know if I had an understanding of why.
You said that you raised the GTV settlement in a meeting at the Himalaya Exchange. Who was in this meeting?
The stakeholders that I mentioned before, as well as William J.E. and head of legal.
And who was the head of legal?
Priya Patel, I believe, is the name.
What did you say about this GTV cryptocurrency settlement in this meeting?
Well, I raised the issue because I felt that, by promoting the coin and by talking about the coin that was being indirectly involved in it. Mr. Skirrick said, Your Honor, can we have a brief sidebar here again?
The court said yes, you may step up.
Continued on next page. At the sidebar.
Mr. Skirrick said, Your Honor. I let two questions go there where the subject of the question was a meeting at the exchange that involved the stakeholders of the exchange including the general counsel of the exchange. Now we're clearly getting into, I think the witness was just asked about what counsel said. In any event, We're clearly in the context of what would be a privileged discussion, and it's inappropriate for the government to elicit testimony.
The court said, "One moment. I just want to hear the question."
Record was read.
The court said, "So what is it that you expect might be elicited that you object to?"
Mr. Skirek said, "I think eliciting any testimony about this conversation where the witness, according to his own words, raising a legal question, a legal issue, concern. And I expect that the next question or 2 or 5 is going to get further into that. In fact, well, I'll leave it at that."
The court said, "I think Mr. Horton is going to tell us about an exception. Go ahead."
Mr. Horton said, "It's the crime-fraud exception is relevant here. First of all, if there was a privilege to assert Himalaya exchange, the lawyers in this meeting aren't able to assert that privilege. They don't represent the Himalaya exchange. I don't believe they're asserting that Priya Patel was representing Miles Gwa. They're free to assert that. That would be relevant to the case. There's a privilege to assert. It's not their privilege to assert. To be really clear, Priya Patel is a co-conspirator. If she speaks on behalf of the instrumentality of a RICO conspiracy, it's not privilege. When she lies to Mr. Brown, it's not privileged."
Mr. Skirek said, "May I just respond to that, Your Honor?" So again we have the agent and co-conspirator exceptions here swallowing the rule. All the government appears to need to say is that someone is an agent of one of the many entities, or just assert that a person is a co-conspirator without so much of proving either of those things out. And then not only do we have testimony coming into evidence for its truth, we also have privileged conversations coming in. Now we're happy to take a break and see if we can raise someone at the exchange to see if they'd like to assert privilege. The government has not. We had no notice that this was going to happen, right? You didn't tell us beforehand that you were going to go through it. We didn't have an opportunity ahead of time to get ahead of this. We're dealing with it in real time. We can't very well say that no one from the exchange is here to assert privilege. That is the ultimate argument."
Mr. Horton said, "Just 2 brief things on that, Your Honor. Ms. Patel all over Mr. Brown's 3500 because this was important for him as the CEO of the exchange. Second thing. There was extensive testimony from Sam Roberts from BitGo about communications he had with Priya Patel where she was not only a spokesperson for the Himalaya exchange. She spoke extensively about Miles Gwa and his relationship to the exchange."
Mr. Skirek said, "I'm not sure what that has to do with anything. Those were third-party conversations. We're talking about privileged conversations."
The court said, "So the government is alleging that she was part of the conspiracy?"
Mr. Skirek said, "I understand that, Your Honor. We understand the court's pretrial ruling to require that there be some proof of that before the testimony comes in. That only takes care of one issue. We're still on the privilege issue."
The court said, "I think the foundation has been laid to establish the rule."
Mr. Skirek said, "In a conspiracy?"
The court said yes.
Mr. Skirek said, "I'm not sure I'm aware of what that evidence is. But I think it's a separate question whether crime-fraud applies. Obviously I think, my understanding at least, is that it would require the court to make a finding that at the advice of counsel was used in connection with a crime. Was used to facilitate a crime. And just a conversation that's happening around a round table about developments with an SEC settlement is far from proving that the lawyer's advice was used in connection with committing a crime."
Mr. Horton said, "Your Honor doesn't need to go there. The question can be about what happened, and Mr. Brown raised the issue of the GTV settlement in this meeting. What happened is not Ms. Patel gave legal advice. She did not give legal advice. For one thing she said, he believes is a lie. Another thing, there's no world in which her response was legal advice."
Ms. Strofa said, "He literally said he raised a legal concern, and he raised it with a lawyer in the meeting in her capacity as a lawyer. She's certainly not there in any other capacity."
Mr. Horton said, "I expect Mr. Brown will testify that after he raised this issue, Priya Patel looked to William J.E. and said, 'That's the first I'm hearing of that.' And he will say that struck him as not credible even what he understood."
Mr. Skirek said, that doesn't make it not true.
Mr. Horton said, "That's not legal advice, this is the first I heard of it."
The court said, "Considering all the testimony concerning Ms. Patel, I think that an accurate foundation has been laid, so I'm going to permit the testimony. I just wanted to make clear that under Guinea I'm making a conditional finding of I'm expecting the prosecution to be making a motion at the end of their case."
In open court, jury present.
The court said, "Overruled. You may continue."
By Mr. Horton.
Mr. Brown. Who were the stakeholders in the Himalaya exchange meeting when you raised the GTV settlement about cryptocurrency?
That would have been the Chief Security Officer, the Chief Operations Officer, the Chief Financial Officer, the Chief Marketing Officer, William J.E., Legal and Internal Audit.
And, sorry, you mentioned Priya Patel before the sidebar?
Yes.
Who is that?
She was the head of legal.
And as you observed it, what was her role at the exchange? What did she do?
She basically made all the decisions at the end, all the commercial decisions.
And who did Ms. Patel report to?
William J.E.
What happened and you raised the SEC settlement with GTV about cryptocurrency in this meeting with the exchange?
There was somewhat of an awkward silence. I observed Priya looking at William and then she basically turned to me and stated that was the first she had heard of it.
Had you previously heard Ms. Patel talk about Miles Gov't?
I don't recall.
How did it strike you when Ms. Patel said that was the first she heard of it?
Between the awkwardness, the sheepness, I found it somewhat untruthful.
Why did you find it somewhat untruthful when Ms. Patel said she hadn't heard about this SEC settlement before?
Mr. Skirrick said, "Objection to relevance, Your Honor."
The court said, "You may answer."
I just felt that she was a competent lawyer. She would have done due diligence and understood it.
Mr. Brown. Why would someone from the Himalaya exchange know about the SEC settlement with GTV from the cryptocurrency?
Mr. Skirrick said, "Objection, hypothetical."
The court said, "Sustained."
Mr. Brown, was it your expectation that Ms. Patel would know what you were talking about?
It was.
Why did you expect that the head of legal at the Himalaya exchange would know about the SEC settlement with GTV on cryptocurrency?
Because she spoke to William all the time and understood all of the dynamics of the relationship between William and Miles. Mr. Skirrick said, "Objection to testifying about what Ms. Patel understood."
The court said, "He cannot speak to what was on her mind, so that portion about what she understood is stricken."
Mr. Brown, why did you expect withdrawn? Did you ask William any questions about the settlement?
I did not.
Why not?
We quickly moved on after that with our regular agenda.
Mr. Brown, you said earlier that Miles Gov't promoted H-Coin on social media. Did you personally observe any of that?
I heard the iTunes song.
I'm going to show you a document that's in evidence as GXC 405. Ms. Loftus, can you please put that up? If you could scroll to the top. Mr. Brown, what is this?
It looks like an article from G News.
And what was G News?
I believe it was one of the entities in Guamedia.
Ms. Loftus, if you could scroll down. Mr. Brown, what you do understand this document shows?
There was a live broadcast and it's reporting highlights from September 29th.
Ms. Loftus, can you please scroll down about just under halfway down the page? There's a paragraph caption. What's the best way to keep the Chinese people's money safe? When you get there, can you enlarge that paragraph? Mr. Brown, do you see this paragraph? It's entitled "What's the best way to keep the Chinese people's money safe without devaluation?"
I do.
Ms. Loftus, in the middle of this paragraph there's a sentence that starts, "The safest virtual coin." If you could highlight that, please. Mr. Brown, could you read this statement?
Yes. The safest virtual coin at the moment is Himalaya coin because 20% of the value is anchored in gold.
Ms. Loftus, can you go to the top and show the date of this interview? Were you the CEO of the Himalaya exchange on September 29, 2021?
I was.
Was it true, Mr. Brown, that 20% of the value of H coin was anchored to gold?
No, it wasn't.
How much of the value of H coin was anchored to gold?
None to my knowledge.
How much of the Himalaya dollar reserve was in gold?
0.
As CEO of the exchange, did you have any role on what Gov't said?
I did not.
Did you ever tell Gov't not to make statements like this?
I did not.
Why not?
I never spoke to Gov't.
And as CEO of the Himalaya exchange, Mr. Brown, were you told to sign documents?
Yes.
Who told you to sign documents?
I was requested to sign documents often by the chief financial officer and also the compliance officer at the time.
And what kinds of documents would these executives at the exchange tell you to sign?
Mostly they were bank applications because getting banking was very difficult for crypto companies at this time. And then also I would sign other things around audits and other things representing the exchange.
What was your understanding of why you were being asked to sign documents that were going to banks and auditors?
Could you repeat that?
What was your understanding, Mr. Brown, of why you were being told to sign documents that were going to banks and auditors?
'Cause I was the CEO.
Did you read these documents when you were asked to sign them?
Yes.
How carefully did you read them?
Not that carefully.
Why is that?
I'm a quick-skin reader.
When, if ever, did you ask a document to be changed before you signed it?
I don't recall ever asking.
And why is that?
They were just typical CEO things I thought needed to be signed and pushed through.
Ms. Loftus, can you please pull up what's in evidence as GXBR 208A? It's the first page. Can you show the second page, Ms. Loftus? You can zoom in on the text above Jesse Brown's CEO signature line to the top of the page, please. Did you sign this document, Mr. Brown?
Yes.
It says US dollars held in Himalaya-owned bank accounts. How much money does it report were being held in the Himalaya-owned bank accounts?
That would be almost over a little over $401 million.
When you signed this as CEO, did you know if this was true?
I did not.
What did you know at that time about how much money the exchange had?
I had no knowledge on any money that the exchange had.
Before you signed this, did you ask anyone to verify if it was true?
I don't recall.
The lines below this refer to collateralized HDO credits on Himalaya ecosystem platforms and collateralized HDO tokens on the Ethereum blockchain. What's the number on the line item for collateralized HDO tokens on the blockchain?
That would be 0.
Where it says collateralized HDO credits on Himalaya ecosystem platform. What does Himalaya ecosystem platforms refer to?
That would be all the entities on the platform.
And what is the purpose, as you understood it, of this document that refers to collateralize HDO credits? What did collateralize mean in this context?
I believe the coin would be collateralized against that amount.
How, if at all, does this document relate to the HDO reserve?
As I stated before in my testimony, with a stable coin each coin has to be backed by $1. And that's what this would have represented.
What, if anything, does this document say about how much gold was used to collateralize $?
There's no gold mentioned in this document.
When you worked at the Himalaya exchange, Mr. Brown, did there come a time you learned about a seizure of funds?
Yes.
And what was the seizure you learned about?
We had funds and I believe it was a bank in Puerto Rico that were frozen by the US government.
How did you find out that the government had frozen the Himalaya exchange funds?
I heard about it in an emergency meeting.
And what did you hear in that emergency meeting at the exchange after the seizure?
I heard that the funds were frozen, and we were going to be unable to provide redemptions.
What were redemptions?
Redemptions are when Himalaya exchange users would cash in their credits and receive fiat for that amount.
The court said, "What do you mean by fiat?"
The witness said, US dollar.
What would it mean for a customer to not be able to make a redemption at the Himalaya exchange?
It would mean that their money was trapped in the exchange and they couldn't take it out and deposit it into their own accounts.
And were you CEO at the time you learned about the seizures?
I was.
What was your understanding of why the exchange stopped redemptions at that time?
Because we were unable to provide any fiat or any US dollar to satisfy the redemption.
Mr. Brown, what effect, if any, was there on the money in the $H reserve after the seizures?
There was no reserve to my knowledge.
What, if anything, would that mean about the status of $H?
It would mean it's no longer backed and worthless.
What did the exchange tell its customers about this?
There was a big customer service push to mention that we were having problems with banking at the time and that we were hoping to resolve them in the immediate future and to please be patient.
Did the exchange say that $H was no longer a stable coin?
They did not.
Was it a stable coin at this point?
No. Mr. Skirrick said, objection.
The court said, sustained.
Were you the CEO at the time, Mr. Brown?
I was.
After the $H reserve the funds were gone, was your understanding that $H was a stable coin?
Mr. Skirrick said, objection, misstates the record.
The court said, was it your understanding? I didn't hear the last part.
The question was as CEO at the time, after the seizure of funds. Was it Mr. Brown's understanding that $H was still a stable coin at this point?
The court said, I'm going to sustain the objection.
Was there any cash left at the exchange at this point as far as you knew, Mr. Brown?
As far as I knew, we were cash-strapped.
Was that disclosed to customers?
It was not.
As the CEO of the exchange at the time, did you have an expectation about how these seizures would affect the price of H coin?
Yes.
And what was your expectation?
Well, at this point there was a lot of fear in the marketplace after what had happened to FTX and some other big exchanges. So there would have been a big run, what's called a run where everyone tries to sell at once.
Just to be clear, what was your expectation about what would happen if anything to the price of the Himalaya exchanges as coins?
Mr. Skirrick said, objection.
The court said, what did you fear? Is that the question?
Mr. Horton said, yes.
The court said, go ahead.
A big price drop because that's what happens during these times.
And what did happen to H coin's price?
Very little.
Were you able to account for that, Mr. Brown?
Mr. Skirrick said, objection, calls for speculation.
The court said, you may answer.
I was not.
Did you ask William J.E. about why the H coin price didn't drop after the seizure?
I did not.
As a CEO at the exchange at the time, Mr. Brown, what, if anything, did you know about the exchange making a $37 million loan?
I recall there was a meeting about that during a meeting we had. We had meetings around, I can't remember the specific term. But it was based on there were 5 or 6 of us in a board and things came up. And we determined we were going to do them collectively as a team or not. I can't remember the exact name of what that group was. But there was a group that collectively made decisions that William J.E. led.
And as the CEO of the exchange at the time, did you know what that $37 million expense was for?
Yes.
What was it for?
It was stated that it was for a loan.
Did you know what the purpose of that loan was as the CEO?
Mr. Skirrick said, objection, foundation.
The court said, you may answer if you know.
Yes, I believe it was for a yacht.
Were you asked to approve that, Mr. Brown?
I was.
What, if anything, did you do to look into the circumstances around the exchange making a $37 million loan for a yacht?
It was discussed. It was discussed internally. There were some objections made. But ultimately it was voted to go ahead and make the loan.
And what understanding, if any, did you have at the time as CEO about why the Himalaya exchange was loaning $37 million for a yacht?
It seemed like a personal loan to me.
Did you take any steps to stop it from going through?
Marios and myself objected and talked through it and then begrudgingly agreed to it.
Who is Marios?
Marios was the COO.
When you say it seemed like a personal loan for who?
Mr. Skirik said, objection to seem like. It's speculation.
The court said, sustained.
Why did it appear to you to be a personal loan?
Mr. Skirik said, same objection.
The court said, sustained.
Why was your understanding that it was a personal loan?
Mr. Skirik said, same objection.
The court said, sustained.
I'll move on. In your 2.5 years at the exchange before that, had the exchange made a loan for a yacht?
No.
Who was this loan for if you knew?
Mr. Skirik said, objection.
The court said you may answer that, yeah.
William stated it was for Miles Gw's daughter.
And what understanding, if any, did you have about why the Himalaya exchange was making a loan for Miles Gw's daughter?
Mr. Skirik said, objection, relevance.
The court said you may answer.
I didn't really have an understanding why.
What happened with this $37 million loan for Miles Gw's daughter after you and the COO objected?
It ultimately passed.
Mr. Brown, did there come a time that your title changed again from CEO to something else?
It did.
What did it change to?
I was promoted to president.
And how, if at all, did your job change when you became president of the exchange?
It didn't really change at all.
How did you find out that you were becoming president of the exchange?
I believe it was in another meeting, a group meeting.
And who told you that you were no longer the CEO?
Well, I had gotten a few messages from colleagues who asked me if I was fired originally.
Before you got those messages asking you if you were fired, what, if anything, did you know about your job title at the exchange?
I didn't know it had changed.
Who replaced you, if anybody, as CEO?
There was a gentleman. His name was Kevin and he replaced me.
And as far as you understood, who picked Kevin to replace you as the Himalaya Exchange CEO?
Mr. Skirik said, objection.
The court said you may answer.
It was well known that he was placed there. Miles Gwa placed him there.
How did you learn that Miles Gwa had placed Kevin at the exchange?
Kevin told me.
Mr. Horton said, if I could have just a moment, Your Honor. Going back to a minute for your interview with Yvette Wang. Were you asked by Ms. Wang about your views of the Chinese Communist Party?
I was not.
Do you have a view of the Chinese Communist Party?
I do not. Mr. Skirik said, objection.
The court said, sustained.
In your 2.5 years at the Himalaya Exchange, Mr. Brown, did you understand it to be a political organization?
I did not.
Mr. Horton said, no further questions, Your Honor.
The court said, cross-examination.
Mr. Skirik said, thank you, Your Honor.
Cross-examination. By Mr. Skirik.
Good afternoon, Mr. Brown. Good afternoon. I'd like to take us back to the beginning here if it's okay with you and just talk about how you got your start in crypto. You first started working in the blockchain and crypto industry in 2016 or thereabout. Yes, late 2016. And do you sort of consider yourself self-taught? That's a fair statement. And we'll get to your work at the Himalaya Exchange in a moment. You had a number of other positions in the industry before the Himalaya Exchange, right? Yes. So let's just walk through them briefly. The first was at Ford, is that correct? Yes, I was. I'll follow up. Thank you. That's the car company, right? Yes. And you were a consultant for 4 to 5 months there. A little bit shorter. And now you can explain if you would what you did there. I was Ford's first blockchain consultant. And the next role you had was working with electronic health records, but it was crypto-related. Is that right? Yes. And the concept was that you would own your own health records, but be able to send them securely over the blockchain. That's correct. And that was in 2017. Yes. And you were there for less than a year or so. Yes. And why was it only a year or so that you were there? I was fired. And then the next venture you went to was something called data blockchain, right? Yes. And you worked there for a couple of years? Yes. And what did data blockchain do? It made it easier for small companies to purchase records to market to people for specific industries. So a mom and pop shop would have the same advantages of someone buying, a $100,000. It was like an advertisement related. Yeah, that's fair. And then a time came when you left there, right? Yes. And why was that? The job ended then. They no longer wanted to pursue issuing a coin. And then at some point you also withdrawn. Following the data blockchain job. At some point you began talking to, if I have it correct, the government of Nevis about a potential crypto project. Is that right? That's correct. And Nevis the Caribbean island? That's correct. And why don't you tell us about that? I was going to raise a token to enable the country to launch a geothermal plant and build data centers there. And what happened with that? Kind of ran out of steam with the government. There was some back and forth. But never got the financing. And how long did that last? It was ongoing back and forth for a couple of years, but it was just something that, These types of things have to pass through multi-layers of government. Just didn't get traction. Yeah. And your next position was at the DTCC, right? Yeah, that's right. And the DTCC is a clearinghouse, is that right? That's right. And it's a clearinghouse for, among other things, stock transactions, transaction in equity, right? Yes.
Continued on next page. By Mr. Skirek.
Okay. And am I right that the DTCC is, probably the largest clearing entity? At least in the United States. Yes, in the world. They settle all over $1 trillion a day in stock transactions. It's a massive operation. Yes. And you were there for approximately 4 months, right? Yes. And then why did you leave that job? That was a consultant role, and it ended. Okay. And now these roles that we just went through. You were not a coder or a programmer in these positions, right? No. No. And you weren't a software engineer, right? No. Because you have no formal training in computer science, right? No. I studied computer science in college. Did you graduate with a degree in computer science? I did not. Okay. And even today, you don't really do coding on crypto projects, right? Your role is a little different. I do. I don't code in Solidity, but I can architect, I read it, I understand it. Sure. But yeah, I don't create production code. Okay. So code not really your thing, right? Not your strength. No, not my strength. As you said before, you're more of a designer or sort of architect for. Architect, yeah. Crypto projects. Okay. And fair enough. So let's just talk, for some of us who are not as initiated in crypto and blockchain as you are, if we can, for a second. About some of the jargon in. Okay. Crypto and blockchain, all right. Yeah. Now so just, what is a blockchain? It's a public ledger. It's called a distributed ledger technology. Okay. And it allows you to record transactions that occur on that chain, right? Yes. Okay. And on a public blockchain, those transactions are visible. That's correct. All right. But there are also transactions that can occur on a public blockchain but that are off-chain. Right. Not to my knowledge. So just to be clear, is it possible to have transactions in cryptocurrency that occur?
Mr. Horton said, objection. Calls for speculation. He asked if it's possible.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, we had extensive testimony about this on direct.
The court said, you may answer.
So it's true, isn't it? That you can have transactions that occur in cryptocurrency that are off blockchain, right? No, that's incorrect. Okay. Now if you have, let's put it this way, Is there such thing as a private blockchain? Yes. Okay. And you testified about that, right? Yes. And for example, you worked with a blockchain project that was in the healthcare industry. Yes. Is that an example of one where it would be a private blockchain? It would be. Okay. So it's not open to the public, it can't be seen by anyone. You have to be invited to enter as a participant on the blockchain in order to see what's happening. Yes. Okay. And are you familiar with JP Morgan coin? Is that JP Morgan you're referring to? Yes. Yes. And is that another example of a private blockchain, or token that trades on a private blockchain? I believe so. Okay. Now these private blockchains. The transactions still occur on the chain even though not everybody can see them from outside, right? Correct. There's privacy involved. Okay. And those tokens that trade are still cryptocurrencies, right? Correct. Now do you know what I mean if I say a centralized cryptocurrency exchange? I do. Okay. And what is that? Just explain that. A centralized cryptocurrency exchange is where the exchange holds the user's keys. And the key is to a wallet, so essentially they hold the crypto for them. Okay. So all of the exchanges, withdrawn. All of the customers' crypto is held in the exchange's wallets, right? Yes, that's true. Okay. And now is it typical for centralized exchanges to have off-chain transactions? No. So let's talk about, are you familiar with Coinbase? I am. Okay. So when Coinbase facilitates a trade between two customers, are all of those transactions recorded on a blockchain, as you understand it? Yes, they would be. All of the transactions recorded on the blockchain? Yes.
Mr. Horton said, objection. Asked and answered.
So to your understanding, centralized exchanges don't use internal mechanisms to match orders, correct?
Mr. Horton said, objection. Asked and answered.
Mr. Skirek said, that's a different question.
The court said, sustained.
Okay. Now are there reasons why an exchange and users may want transactions to happen off a chain?
Mr. Horton said, objection. Calls for speculation. Your Honor.
The court said, you may answer.
Could you repeat, counsel? Sure. Are there reasons why users may want transactions in cryptocurrency to happen off-chain? I couldn't think of any. Okay. Maybe I'll suggest some to you and you can let me know if they make sense. Do off-chain transactions settle more quickly than on-chain transactions, typically? Depends on the network congestion at the time. Sure. But with Ethereum, for example. Ethereum can be slipped sometimes, right? That's just a... Well, the most recent upgrade has eliminated most of that. Let me just...
Mr. Horton said, objection. He's got to let the witness answer the question.
Mr. Skirek said, I hadn't finished my question.
The court said, you have to let him answer before the next question.
Mr. Skirek said, I believe the witness started talking before I ended my question, that's all. But it's fine. We can move on. Finish. Mr. Brown, we just have to wait for each other to.
The witness said, sorry, counsel.
Mr. Skirek said, no problem. I apologize too.
By Mr. Skirek.
So my question again was, is one reason that off-chain transactions might be preferable is because they settle more quickly? I guess you could make that case.
The court said, so I don't want you to guess. If you know, you can say yes or no, or you can say I don't know, or I don't remember. Something like that.
The witness said, all right.
It's a possibility, right?
The court said, no, I'm not asking him to speculate. Don't speculate.
Can you repeat the question again, please? Sure. Is one reason that participants in a transaction may want to settle off-chain? They want to conduct transactions off a chain in crypto because it settles faster.
Mr. Horton said, object to the form of the question, Your Honor.
The court said, I'll allow the question.
I don't agree with that. Even something, what you're referring. Okay. Okay. I don't agree. I don't agree. Are you familiar with something called gas? Yes. Okay. And is gas the fee that one has to pay in order to use a public blockchain? No. Gas is the fee for the Ethereum public blockchain. Okay. Fine. So is one reason that people may want to have off-chain transactions because they are less expensive to settle because you don't have to pay gas.
Mr. Horton said, objection. Calls for speculation.
Mr. Skirek said, it's his understanding, Your Honor.
The court said, I'll allow the question.
That's true. Okay. Now in fact, a significant amount of cryptocurrency transactions today happen on centralized exchanges, right? Right. Okay. And viewed from the outside, is it your understanding that centralized exchanges have a number of wallets in which they hold customers' crypto? Yes. And that they don't necessarily have a separate wallet for every customer, right? Yes. Right. The customer may have their, I see your hesitation, so let's get there. So the customer may have his or her, its own wallet, right? Yes. But the exchange itself has its wallets, and for tokens that it custodies, the exchange custodies. They hold them in those wallets, right?
Mr. Horton said, objection to the testifying, Your Honor.
The court said, I'll allow the question.
Correct. Okay. And so when there is a transaction, say, between two users on Coinbase, it's true, isn't it? That those tokens that the users want to exchange may reside in the same exchange wallet? Yes. Okay. In that scenario, were those two customers to engage in a transaction? You could not see that transaction happen from the outside, right? That is not true. You could see into the exchange's wallet, is your testimony.
The court said, sustained, asked and answered.
Mr. Skirek said, okay, Your Honor. Can you tell me how one can see inside Coinbase wallets? Any transaction made on Ethereum blockchain, whether it's what you're referring to, Coinbase or any level 2, is still broadcast on the public blockchain. Now remember, I just want to make sure that we're clear. The question that I asked you before was whether, if two users whose tokens are held in a single wallet, single exchange wallet, want to engage in a transaction. That's what I'm talking about. Does that make sense? Can you repeat it again? Yes, sir. So if you have two users on an exchange, on a centralized exchange, and the exchange's wallet holds both users' tokens, and those users engage in a transaction, are you with me so far? Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. You cannot see into that wallet when that transaction happens, right? You cannot see into the exchange's wallet.
Mr. Horton said, objection. Asked and answered.
Mr. Skirek said, he asked me to clarify, Your Honor. I'm just trying to clarify.
The court said, you may answer.
It sounds true. Right. So if you have transactions that are happening on a centralized exchange, it is the case that sometimes you can't see those transactions because they happen inside a wallet, not across the blockchain. Fair enough. Okay. All right. Thank you. Now let's just go back to your work history here for a second and talk about the Himalaya exchange. So I believe you testified on direct that you started work in June 2020, is that right? Yes. Okay. And this was during the pandemic, as everybody knows. Right. Yes. And you were at home, stuck at home like the rest of us. I was. Okay. And now at that time the crypto and blockchain sectors were pretty hot, is that fair to say? Popular. Yeah, that's fair to say. Enjoying some media and press, fair to say. Yeah, at that point. Yeah. Okay. And is it also fair to say that you felt like you had a lot of potential job opportunities around that time? Yeah, that's a fair point. Right. And I mean, do you recall telling the government when you met with them that your phone was ringing off the hook around this point in time? My phone rings off the hook. At this point in time. I have no doubt. All the time. But at this point in time. At this point in time, just to be clear. Yes. Okay. And then you testified on direct, a first interview with someone named Yvette Wong. Right. Yes. Okay. And fair to say this was sort of an initial interview with Ms. Wong. It was. And did you get the sense that Ms. Wong knew anything about blockchain or crypto?
Mr. Horton said, objection.
Mr. Skirrick said, asking his impression.
The court said you can answer that question, yeah.
I didn't get the impression she knew a lot about blockchain or crypto. Okay. It was just sort of a general interview, right? Yes. And it was relatively short. It was probably half an hour. There was another gentleman involved in that interview too. Sure. And was that one call that you had with Ms. Wong and the other gentleman, or were there two? They were both on the same call. And it was a single call. Yes. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for that. And the person who was on that call was the Chief Technology Officer of GTV. Yes. Okay. And did that person ask you some questions about blockchain? He did. Okay. Now following the call you had, I believe you testified on direct, an interview with Mr. J.E. Right. Yes. Okay. And now there were two interviews with Mr. J.E., right? Yes. Okay. Yes, I believe. Right. And the first interview happened fairly shortly after the first interview with Ms. Wong, right? Yes. Okay. And you took those interviews via video call, I believe you testified. Yes. Okay. And the scope of the job, as you understood it, was that you were interviewing for blockchain architect. Yes. And the role wasn't for a CEO role. It was not. Right. Okay. And now can you just tell us a little bit about what you discussed with Mr. J.E. during that first call? I went over my job history and kind of dug into the DTCC component of it. Okay. And did he seem particularly interested in your work at the DTCC? He did. Okay. And you spoke in depth with him about blockchain and finance? Yes. I crushed the interview. As history shows. And you had the impression that William J.E. had a lot of experience in finance, right? Tremendous amount. Right. And you found him pretty impressive, I think you said, right? Very impressive. And knowledgeable, right? Very knowledgeable. Okay. Now you didn't talk to William J.E. during the first interview about GTV, did you? I did not. Right. That didn't come up, right? I don't recall it coming up. Yeah. You were talking about the idea of an exchange. I was pitching the chain. Sure. A crypto chain. Yeah. And the tokens, right? Yeah. Okay. And one of the tokens that you talked about was, I think, what we've been referring to here today as a stable coin. Right. Yes. All right. And that's basically sort of like a crypto dollar, is that a fair? That's a good analogy. Analogy. Okay. And the idea was for that crypto dollar to be backed by cash, right? Yes. Okay. And eventually, and we'll get to this later, but eventually that becomes HDO, right? Yes. Okay. And then the second token that you talked to him about was what people referred to as a trading coin. Yes. All right. And that is what eventually becomes HCN, right? Correct. Okay. And did you talk to Mr. J.E. about a longer-term vision for the exchange too during these interviews? I didn't. Yeah. And what was his longer-term vision, to your understanding? His envision was to be the biggest exchange in the world. Okay. And was he also trying to, as you understood it, create an ecosystem, so to speak? Yes. Okay. And to recruit merchants who would accept these coins for payment for various goods and services. Right. That is correct. Okay. And did that strike you as a pretty grand vision at the time? Yeah, I thought it was cool. Okay. Now is it fair to say these two interviews with Mr. J had a lot more substance to them than the initial interview with Ms. Wang? Yes. Okay. And you felt like the interviews with Mr. J were sort of the ones that counted, right? I felt they all counted. Okay. Did you feel like you had to impress Mr. J? Yeah, you have to impress anyone when you're trying to get a job. And you said before you crushed it, right? Killed it. Yeah, killed it. Killed it. So you felt like you were out to impress him, fair to say. Just.
Mr. Horton said, asked and answered.
Just doing what I do. We get it. We get it. Now did you have the impression that Mr. J was the decision maker as to who to hire? I did. Yeah. And do you know if he was interviewing any other candidates?
Mr. Horton said, objection.
Mr. Skirrick said, to his knowledge.
The court said, you may answer.
None that I was aware of. Mr. Skirrick said, okay. So if we could just briefly please pull up the government exhibit that's in evidence, 3419. And you see this document, Mr. Brown? I do, counsel. And you were shown this on direct, right? Could you repeat that? You were shown this document on your direct testimony. Yes, yes. Right. Okay. And this was the offer letter that came from GTV, right? Right. Okay. Now before you accepted the job, did you look up Mr. Gov't? I don't believe I did. Okay. So at the time you had no idea what Gov't Media was, right? Well, can I retract that? I did do a little bit of research, yeah, typical quick scan. Okay. And you believe that these companies, that GTV was associated with Mr. Gov't, right? Right. Okay. Now I believe you testified that you saw your job as part of the same job, withdrawn. That you saw your job at the Himalaya exchange as part of the same job as the GTV job, right? Well, I was hired by GTV. Right. Did you ever talk to Yvette Wang again? I did one other time. And what was the purpose of that? She was calling to push along our development. They were getting very frustrated that we weren't delivering on time, as I stated previously in my testimony. Okay. So that call had nothing to do with GTV, right?
Mr. Horton said, objection.
The court said, sustained.
Okay. What is Gov't Media? I'm sorry. Let me take that back. At this point in time, in June of 2020. What's your understanding of what Gov't Media is? Just a large group of social media companies and of publications, a lot of it politically driven. You understood that in June of 2020? Yeah, I think so. And then how was Gov't Media different from GTV, again, as you understood it in June of 2020? I didn't know. I don't know that. You don't know? No. Can you name an employee of Gov't Media? The first interviewer that I had, yeah. Besides, do you know that she was employed by Gov't Media? Or the technology, the head of tech, yeah. Okay. So besides the two people that you spoke to, can you name another employee of Gov't Media? I cannot. Can you name another employee of GTV? I can't name them, but I've been on a couple of video calls with them later on. Okay. So just to be clear, your service for the Himalaya exchange was different than, and separate from Gov't News and Gov't Media, right?
Mr. Horton said, objection. It's a compound question.
Mr. Skirrick said, I'll take it piece by piece.
The court said, okay.
So just to be clear, your work for the Himalaya exchange was separate from GTV, right? I wouldn't say that. At the beginning, I was employed by GTV. I talked to their PR person, I mean, their human resource person. Mr. Quite a bit. I just want you to listen to my question, okay? Okay. Apart from interviewing with people who you believe to work at GTV, okay? Did you ever work with anyone else at GTV?
Mr. Horton said, asked and answered.
The court said, you may answer.
I did. I worked with human resource. In connection with with GTV. Let me finish. This is the part where we have to let each other finish, okay? Sorry, counsel. So you worked with human resources to get set up to be paid by GTV. That's correct. Okay. Other than that, did you work with GTV at all? No. Okay. Same question for Gov't. Other than initial administrative setup stuff. Did you do any work with Gov't? I did not. Okay. So now we get to the question. Your work at the Himalaya exchange was separate from GTV, right? Correct. And it was separate from Gov't, whatever that is, right? Yes. Okay. Now you testified on direct, I believe, that you never met in person. I should say, your work colleagues from Himalaya, is that right? Right. Okay. Now isn't it true that at the time Himalaya was a startup company? That's right. Okay. And it had employees at that point in time, again, we're just focusing on, June 2020, it had employees who were all over the world, right? Well, in June of 2020, there were only 3 of us, but yes, they were all scattered over the world. Scattered over the world, right? And as we covered before, this was during COVID, right? That's right. Okay. And the folks who were scattered over the world, just to cover off the geography. Some were in the UK, right? Right. Some were in Australia. Yes. Is that fair? Fair. You were in the US. Yes. And some were other places, right? Yes. Okay. So for the period when COVID was still with us, people didn't travel all that much, right? No. Right. And, you didn't think that these people that you worked with for 2.5 years were, not real people, right? No, they were real people. They were real people, right? Doing real work. Yes. Okay. So just to be clear, just because you didn't meet them in person, that didn't mean that they weren't real people doing real work, right? That's correct. Okay. Now you also testified that GTV paid your salary, I believe from June to December of 2020, right? Correct. Okay. And then shortly after that you started to be paid by Himalaya, right? After I was kicked to the curb by GTV. Well, we'll get to that. And let's just keep it to the facts, right? The question was, after you left GTV, you were being paid by Himalaya, right? Yes. Okay. And do you know whether Hamilton or Himalaya reimbursed GTV for its payment of your salary? I do not know that, counsel. Okay. Now when you started at Himalaya, just to reset now and go back to that, when you started at Himalaya, again. In June of 2020, you knew to report to Mr. J.E., right? Right. Okay. That was, clear to you off the bat. Yes. Okay. And because you had initial calls with him, right? Yes. Right. And you had some Skype messages with him? Yes. Okay. And at that time, as I think you alluded to before, the Himalaya also hired some other people. Right. That's correct. And some other senior people, like you, right? Yes, but they weren't Himalaya employees. Okay. Per se. We'll get to that. Now at the time that you started working for the exchange, it wasn't called the Himalaya Exchange yet, right? I'm not sure that's true. I believe it was called the Himalaya Exchange by the time I had left GTV and gone and worked there. Okay. Do you recall telling the government in your meetings with them that you had some input into naming Himalaya Exchange? I did not have input into naming Himalaya Exchange, but the coins I did. How about, fair enough. And who is Marios Mamzaris? He was the chief operating officer. Okay. And was Marios also someone who was hired around the same time that you were? Yeah. I was the assistant, yes. Yes is fine. Yes. Okay. And he was a blockchain consultant, right? He was. And he eventually became, as we just covered, the chief operating officer. That's correct. And he was based in Greece, right? That's right. Okay. And you all worked remotely together. That's true. Okay. And then there was also someone, and you may need to help me with this, named D1. Yes. D. I'm sorry. D, and was that D first or last name? That was his first name. And what was his last name? I can't recall. Okay. Unfortunately. And how long did you work with D? The whole duration. For 2.5 years. Yes. Okay. And he was the head of IT. He was. Okay. And again, he was also hired around the same time. I'm not sure that's true. I believe he had been working for William long before that. He was brought into the project around the same time, right? He was before me, a little before me. Okay. But. Yes. Within a couple months of you joining, right? Yes. Okay. And then was there a compliance person who also joined around the same time? The compliance person would have been a month or two later. Okay. Fair enough. I mean, within a couple of months I would consider around the same time. If that makes sense to you. Fair. Okay. Now when you came on to join the exchange project, was it your understanding that the project already had obtained a license in Australia? I'm not sure if it had already obtained it, but it was obtained, right away. Sure. So it was either obtained or in the process of obtaining it. Correct. And ultimately it did get the license in Australia. That's right. And what was the license for? The license was for the exchange to conduct business as an exchange in Australia. Okay. And as I think we covered before, there was also a compliance person who was based in Australia. Right. Yes. All right. But ultimately the exchange decided to move away from the idea of operating out of Australia because of tax implications. Is that your understanding? That's correct. Okay. Now let's talk about Hamilton briefly. Now you became familiar with Hamilton after starting your job in June of 2020, right? Yes. Okay. And you understood that Hamilton was an investment firm, is that fair? Yes, that's fair. And it had a consulting wing, as people say, to it. Yes. Okay. And that both of those were started by Mr. J.E., right? Correct. And he was the owner of both of those. The UBO, yes. UBO. Okay. I wasn't going to use it, but you used it, so we'll go with it. So he was the UBO. Now Hamilton had, in your understanding, at this time, a pretty big office in the UK, right? They eventually got an office, yes. Okay. And as Hamilton grew, they started to put more people in place, right? Right. And more people in place who were working on the exchange project, right? Yes. Now I believe you testified earlier that it was hard for Hamilton and Mr. J.E. to get people to come into the office during the pandemic. Right. To get talented people. Right. And Mr. J.E. wanted people in the office, right? Yes, that was a mandate. Okay. And as you said, as a result, in your view, you felt like perhaps the exchange project didn't get some of the best people they could have gotten because of that. Requirement that people come into the office. True. Okay. Now again, even at this stage, in the second half of 2020 now, just to put down a time marker. Still fair to say that the exchange project is in startup mode, right? Yes. Okay. And there was a lot of excitement in startup mode. Folks were excited about trying to build this product, right? Fair to say. That's fair. Right. A lot of passion. A lot of passion. Right. And a lot to do. Could you repeat that? And a lot to do. Yes. Right. But especially given the big goals that we talked about before that Mr. J.E. had, right? Right. And it sort of felt overwhelming sometimes, fair to say. I wasn't overwhelmed. Okay. Now you said that you never met Mr. J.E. in person on direct, right? Correct. Okay. And again, this is during the time of COVID. That covers a fair part of the period that you worked there, right? Right. Okay. Now when you joined the exchange, and again, I'm focusing on, let's say, the sort of back half of 2020 into maybe early 2021, is it fair to say that your impression was that there was a lot of money being spent to stand up this project? Yes. And can you just give us some examples of that? Well, we had a huge payroll, we had huge tech bills and huge cloud bills. And we were developing data centers. Okay. And you had outside vendors for various things as well? Yes, quite a few. Okay. And I believe you told the government that you thought the IT spending was in the millions of dollars. Just to get things stood up, right? It was. Okay. And at this point you understood that the money for these startup costs was coming from Mr. J.E. Right. Yes. And in early, withdrawn. In 2020 and early 2021, the exchange hadn't sold any tokens to anybody. Right, prior to April of 2021. Correct. The exchange hadn't raised any money, as far as you knew, right? As far as I knew. Right. And they didn't sell any HCN during that period? No. They didn't sell any HDO during that period? No. Okay. So pretty clear to you that during this time the money that was spent to build the exchange was not money from investors? Yes. And not money from token purchasers? Yes. Or anyone else, as far as you knew? Yes. Okay. And I believe you told the government, am I correct, that it was something of?
The court said, you had testified that there were no token purchases, is that correct?
Mr. Skirek said, at that point in time, Your Honor.
The witness said, at that point in time.
The court said, okay, go ahead.
And it was something of a withdrawn. You and your colleagues would talk about how much money was being spent on the exchange, right, to stand it up.
Mr. Horton said, objection. Hearsay.
The court said, you may answer.
Yeah, a few of us talked about exorbitant expenses, yes. Yeah. Okay. So let's just briefly talk about the exchange's leadership team. So you have Mr. J.E., right? Who's the UBO? Yes. And sort of, at this point de facto head of the operation, right? Sort of like, titles aside. He's calling the shots, right? Head honcho. Yeah, sure. Okay. And then you have David Fallon, who is the CEO at Hamilton, right? Is that your understanding? Not sure about I knew CEO. I knew he was a fund manager. Okay. Fair enough. But he's a senior figure at Hamilton. Yes. Fair? And maybe one manager under him. Yes. And Tim Clark, who was Tim Clark? Yes, he was the first CTO. Okay. You weren't a fan of his, right? Not of his skill set. I liked him as a person though. Sure. Okay. But at some point, withdrawn. At this point in time, again. Focusing on late 2020, early 2021, Tim is the Chief Technology Officer, right? That's right. Okay. And later he gets replaced by somebody else, right? Right. Okay. And then Tom O'Leary, who is Tom O'Leary? He was the Chief Marketing Officer that was hired during that time. And then we talked about Marios Mamzaris. And he was the COO, right? Yes. Okay. And then how about Azim Bashir? He was the Chief Security Officer. Okay. So Chief Information Officer, Chief Security Officer. Yes, yes. And who's Joe Wong? Joe Wong. I'm not sure I recall that name. Okay. How about Hesop, Ph. Chin? He was the compliance officer from Australia. So that's the person we referred to before. Yes. And Hesop was the chief compliance officer for the exchange, right? Yes. Okay. And then how about Eson Hack? He was the lead counsel at that time. Okay. And now I think we just listed roughly 8 or 9 fairly senior people who were working at the exchange during this period of time. Fair to say? Well, they were working for Hamilton Consulting. Right. They were spending a lot of their time working on the exchange, right? Because those were the people you were working with. That's true. Right. So fair to say that there were 8 or 9 senior people who were working at the exchange during that period of time. On the exchange? Forgive me. In the spring. There weren't that many in the fall. Are we talking, I'm sorry, 2020? Yeah, during the first, it took a little while to onboard all those executives. So it was probably January of 2021 before everyone was in place there. Okay. Fair. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. So in the fall and sort of winter of 2020. There's still this gearing up that's happening with the exchange. Yes. The exchange is still hiring talent and hiring senior people, right? Yes. Okay. And in your recollection, that kind of comes together in roughly January of 2021. Yes. Okay. And then at its peak, how many people did Hamilton have working on the exchange, approximately? Well, there were 200 employees. Okay. In London at one point. Right. So isn't it true that the exchange, withdrawn? Understanding that the consulting wing of Hamilton was the former employer of some of these people, okay. We accept that. But those people were working on the exchange project, is that fair? That is fair, counsel. A fair description. Okay. So understanding that. Is it fair to say that the exchange employed multiple people in finance who were working on the exchange? That's fair. And multiple people in IT who were working on the exchange? Multiple. Yes, correct. And multiple developers, right? Yes. Okay. And now the exchange also had a 24/7 customer service line, right? That is correct. Okay. And when does that come in? That was early on too, probably about that same period. Maybe lagged a couple weeks to get everyone in place. Okay. Fair. The exchange didn't really have any customers, which we'll get to in a second. Until kind of later in 2021, right? Yeah, it was a training and onboarding period. So the exchange was getting ready and getting prepared to have a customer service function when it anticipated having customers. Yes. Okay. And that was, again, a 24/7 operation, right? It was. And it wasn't even outsourced, right? No. And they were employed directly by the exchange, or Hamilton, right? Yes. And the customer service folks spoke both Mandarin and English, right? The majority, right? And fair to say you found that pretty impressive? I did. Yeah. Okay. Now let's just talk a little bit about the day-to-day work. And you touched on this I believe on direct a little bit, but you had daily conference calls, is that fair? Yes. Okay. And those conference calls started pretty early for you, right? 7 a.m. Yeah. 7 a.m., 'cause a lot of other folks were across the pond and a few hours ahead. Yes. Time zone-wise. Right. And sometimes you had one-on-one meetings with different of your senior colleagues. I did. Okay. And sometimes did you have one-on-one meetings with William? Not really. Okay. Well, did you have meetings with William where there were like 1 or 2 other people there? Yes. Okay. He wasn't alone often in meetings, he had people who came with him, right? Right. But understanding that, you did have lots of interaction with William during this period, right? Yes. Okay. And is it fair to say that your weekly schedule was made up of a Monday call that was a sort of all-employees meeting? Yes. And either William or Azim would sort of run that meeting. That's correct. And then on Tuesdays were for tech meetings, right? As I recall, yes. Okay. And that was run by the Chief Technology Officer, right? Yes. And you would have, depending on the time, anywhere from between sort of 20 to 30 people on those calls, right? Tuesday calls. No. Probably closer to 10 or 15. Okay. 10 or 15 people on the Tuesday calls. And then on Wednesdays, you would have operations meetings. Right. Yes. And those were run by the COO of the exchange, right? Correct. Okay. And about how many people attended those, on average? That's about the same as tech. Okay. And then Thursdays you had finance meetings, right? Yes. All right. And then on Fridays you had stakeholder meetings, right? That's right. And that was the phrase that was used to describe the sort of more senior group of executives. Including you. That's true, but most of the stakeholders were involved in all the meetings. Yeah, fair enough, but you had kind of a separate call. Yes. To a smaller, more senior group. Correct. Okay. Now that's an awful lot of people working on this project, isn't it? It is. All right. And do you recall, and I believe you, again, may have touched on this on direct, that you filled out what I'll just call time sheets? I don't know if that's the right word. But do you know what I'm referring to? I do. Okay. And you sort of, in a chart format, listed kind of what you had done for the weeks of the month, for the entire month, right? That's right. In summary. Correct. Okay. And that was kind of the way that you build the exchange so that you could be paid for your work. That's right. All right. And what was your salary during this period of time? I believe I started at 180,000. Okay. Now let's just talk a little bit about the sort of evolution of the exchange from a regulatory perspective. We talked before about the exchange initially thinking that it might operate with an Australia license, right? That's right. Okay. But that was abandoned, as we discussed before, right? Right. Okay. And then there was a pivot to potentially operating out of the British Virgin Islands, right? That's right. We're going to get to the surfing. I promise. Okay. I want to hear more about that. Now that decision to pivot to the BVI. Do you have an understanding of why that was? I believe it was a jurisdiction where we could issue the coin without having a license at the time. Okay. So it was favorable from a regulatory point of view. It was. Just more relaxed from a regulatory point of view. At the time, yes. At the time, right. And so you actually were asked to travel to the BVI. I was. Okay. And to explore establishing an entity there, right? That's right. And you actually hired lawyers down there, right? Yes. Okay. And you made a recommendation as to who to hire, right? No, I did not make the recommendation. Did you meet with the lawyers? I did. Okay. And then there was this BVI sandbox application, right? Correct. That you testified about on direct, right? Right. Okay. And when was this, approximately, that you go down BVI to explore the BVI sandbox? I believe it would have been in the late spring or summer of 2021, but I don't recall exactly. Okay. All right. Fair enough. But definitely 2021, it wasn't 2020. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Now I believe you also testified on direct that you kind of did some prospecting for potential office space down in the BVI. Yes. Right. And you also looked for some telecom providers. Yeah, yes, I did. Like data, internet service providers. Yes. Which one needs to run a crypto exchange, right? Yes. And then you also spoke to people in the BVI FSC, right? Yes. And is that the Financial Services Committee? Committee? Or commission? Yeah, one of those two. Whatever, it's a regulator down on BVI. Right. It's a regulating body there. Understood. Regulating body. And you spoke to them about that sandbox application, right? Yes. And about how long were you down in the BVI? I would only go down for a couple weeks at a time, but I went back and forth few times. Okay. 2 times, more than 2 times. I think it was 3 total. 3. Okay. And this sandbox application? That was because the BVI was sort of looking to attract innovative technologies and businesses in the islands.
Mr. Horton said, objection.
To your understanding.
The court said, overruled. You may answer.
Yes. Okay. And it was called a sandbox, again, asking for your understanding. Sandbox is sort of a metaphor. Right, for being able to play. Yeah. Right. Yes. And you can play because the rules are a little bit more relaxed, as you described before. They are. Right. Okay. And you discovered that in order to succeed on a BVI sandbox application, you had to have, I think it was 50% or so of your employees based on the islands. That's correct. Right. And fair to say that became something that was a little difficult to work with given where most of the folks for the exchange were located throughout the world. I'm not sure that's fair. Well, in any event, it was something that you all found difficult to work with as a condition, right?
Mr. Horton said, objection. Asked and answered.
The court said, sustained.
Mr. Skirrick said, did I ask that question? Okay. In any event, you ended up and the exchange ended up abandoning the BVI effort, right? Yes. But it got, fair so say, to at least sort of, withdrawn. Would you say that it got to a mature stage as a possibility of where to run operations out of? That's a.
Mr. Horton said, object to the form of the question.
The court said you can answer.
That's a fair statement. Okay. And there was significant resources invested in that effort, right? No. That's incorrect. There weren't significant resources invested in it.
Mr. Horton said, objection. Asked and answered.
The court said, sustained.
Okay. Did the exchange have to hire lawyers to work on the sandbox application? Yeah, they hired lawyers. Okay. And they were paying you, right? They were paying me. Okay. You don't consider that a significant investment, I guess.
Mr. Horton said, objection.
The court said you may answer.
I don't, because they weren't willing to pay the rent. And by rent, you mean literally the. Yeah, they weren't willing to put a deposit down on the office. Okay. All right. Fine. So they didn't want to put down the money for the office. So whatever the reason was, that didn't end up panning out, right? Yes. It would have been nice if it had. Much to my chagrin. Yes. It would have been nice if it had. Now while you were down there. I think you said you worked on some other sort of side projects. I said that. Let's try it this way. Did you work on any other side projects that were not exchange related when you were down in the BVI? Yeah, I did have a side project by that point. Okay. And I believe you testified on direct that you were really only working 3 or 4 hours a day for the exchange. That's fair. Right. And you were spending the rest of the time, fair to say, either surfing or working on your side project, right? That's right. Okay. Now after the exchange gives up, well, withdrawn. Can you kind of give us your best estimate as to when the decision is made to, not to the BVI anymore? I believe it was right after we got denied the sandbox application. Right. Okay. And then there was another pivot. And this was to potentially move the exchange operations to Abu Dhabi, right? That's right, counsel. Okay. And then the exchange started working on trying to get licensed in Abu Dhabi, right? Correct. Okay. And this, withdrawn. Did Mr. J.E. ask you at any point whether you would be willing to move to the BVI if the exchange had successfully been able to locate in the BVI? He did. He did. And you told him you were willing to do that, right? More than willing. Sounds like it. And did Mr. J.E. also ask you at other times whether you would be willing to relocate for this job to other locations? He did. Okay. And did he ask you if you'd be willing to relocate within the United States? Yes. And did he ask you whether you'd be willing to locate to Europe? No. To the UK? No. Okay. And at some point did he ask you whether you'd be willing to relocate to Abu Dhabi? He did. Okay. And that's one you weren't willing to do, right? That's right. Okay. Now what? Mr. Skirrick said, I'm sorry. If I could just have one moment, Your Honor. Okay. Now when it comes to Abu Dhabi, you had the impression that Mr. J.E. sort of felt comfortable there. Right.
Mr. Horton said, objection.
Like he knew the landscape.
The court said you may answer that whether he felt comfortable, whether by observing him, you got the impression that he felt comfortable.
I did. Yeah. Like he sort of knew the landscape there. Knew the landscape and connected. Right. Okay. And at this point in time, and we're talking about Abu Dhabi, it's sort of early fall 2021. Is that fair? Early fall 2021. No, I believe that would have been a 2022 thing. Okay. I'm not sure of the dates though. All right. Fair enough. It was sort of in the later stages of your time there, fair to say. Yes. Okay. Now I just want to talk a little bit about this credit system that was much discussed on Direct. Okay. Okay. Can you just tell me how the credit system worked? Sure. So a user would be on board onto the exchange, they would go through a compliance checklist. They would be accepted by the exchange, and then they would be asked to top up their account with dollar. And then they would purchase these credits with those. Okay. And the credits would show in their account on their dashboard. Okay. Got it. Sorry. And I think you used the phrase, top up there. Yes. Now was there a reason that phrase was used in particular? Yeah, it's a London term. Sure. And was part of the reason that it was used, to your understanding? Because the word deposit would connote a banking transaction, right? That's right. Right. And so, top up was a better way to put it, right? There was some discussion back and forth. We ended up with top up. Okay. And so once let's just call them dollars. Is that fair to say? They were almost always US dollars that were used to top up accounts. That's right. Okay. So once the dollars were put into an account. As I understand it, and you'll confirm this for me, the customer would receive a credit on Himalaya's internal records for an equivalent in the relevant.
Mr. Horton said, objection to counsel testifying about his understanding.
Mr. Skirrick said, I can rephrase. I'm happy to rephrase. That's fine.
The court said go ahead.
Is it fair to say that the way that it worked was that a customer would top up an account with dollars and then the exchange would issue the customer a credit on its internal books? Internal ledger, for the relevant cryptocurrency.
Mr. Horton said, object to form.
The court said you may answer.
That's a fair statement, yes, that's true. Okay. And when the customer wanted to make a trade, the exchange would, on its internal ledger, move those credits as appropriate on its internal ledger, right? That's how I understood it, yes. Okay. And if a user?
The court said, "Are you testifying as to what you understood was the system or what actually happened?"
The witness said, "What I understood was the system."
The court said, "In other words, that was what you understood to be the plan?"
The witness said, "Yes, yes."
The court said, "Go ahead."
By Mr. Skirek.
And when a user wanted to, for example, purchase HCN, the trading coin, with HDO that the user held, that transaction would be affected on the exchange's internal ledger, correct? Correct. So you could use HDO credits to buy HCN, right? Yes. Okay. And then the HCN credit was tradable with others who had HCN or HDO, right? Yes. And the HDO credits were redeemable for cash, right? Right. Okay. All right. Now is it fair to say that the credit system that we just talked about wasn't meant to last forever at the exchange? I believe that's fair. Right. You had plans to further develop the system, right? Yes. And move away from the credit system, right? Yes. Right. And the plan ultimately was for the exchange to operate on-chain, right? That was the plan. And to do away with the credit system, right? Eventually, yes. Right. And the plan was for the exchange to become a regular crypto exchange that would allow trading in other cryptocurrencies besides HCN and HDO. Right. That was a goal, yes. Right. And no different than other crypto exchanges, right? In the sense that you could trade other cryptocurrencies. Yes, it would have been more like a typical exchange at that point. Okay. And those goals were ones that the Himalaya team that we talked about earlier was working towards. Right. Yes. Okay. And in fact, the plan, as we talked about earlier, was for the exchange to eventually become a full-blown ecosystem. The ambitious plan, yes. Yeah, fair. We covered that before. Very ambitious, but that was the plan. And in fact, that's what people were working towards, right?
Mr. Horton said, asked and answered.
Mr. Skirek said, the ecosystem is different, Your Honor.
The court said, sustained.
Okay. Now as part of the ecosystem, there was a plan at the exchange to build what was called a merchant portal, right? Yes. Okay. And what was that? It was a portal that would consist of retail clients who would be able to accept HCN or HDO as payment and ship products. Okay. Right. And merchants in this context means like businesses, right? Yes. And so the idea was that the exchange was building something that would allow businesses to accept the tokens that were traded on the exchange. That's right. Right. And so the idea was so that people could transact in those tokens. Yes. Right. And are you aware of something called HPay? Yes, I am. Okay. And is it true that Hamilton and the folks at the exchange were working on an HPay app? That is true. Okay. And true that people at Hamilton complained that the merchant portal was not being built as quickly as they wanted it to be. Right. Not people at Hamilton complained. Didn't. Could you rephrase that? Sure. Was Mr. J.E. at points frustrated that the merchant portal wasn't coming along as quickly as he wanted? He was. Right. And he was a little frustrated that the ecosystem wasn't coming along as quickly as he wanted. To a lesser extent. Okay. And how about same question with respect to HPay? HPay was started much later, so there wasn't big frustration level there. But probably a minor frustration level. But it was started, there was actual work done on HPay, right? Yes. And there was actual work done on the merchant portal, right? Yes. Right. And you didn't see anything the whole time you were there to suggest that people weren't working towards these things. Right. That's correct. Okay. Now do you recall telling the government that it was your impression that Mr. J.E. was out hustling to get merchants onto the platform? Could you rephrase that one more time? Could you say that again? Sure. I'll try it again. Do you recall telling the government, in your meetings with them, that it was your impression that Mr. J.E. was out hustling to get merchants onto the platform? I don't recall stating that, no. Okay. Let's see if we can refresh your recollection. Mr. Skirek said, can we pull up for just the parties and the witness, Jorge, please, 3506, at 13. If I may just have one moment. Your Honor. So Mr. Brown, do you see the excerpt of the document that's appeared on your screen? I do. And do you see the highlighted portion of that document? I do. Okay. Does that refresh your recollection of having said? It does. That to the government? It does. Thank you. So you did tell the government in your meetings with them that in fact Mr. J.E. was out hustling to get merchants onto the platform. Right. Yes.
Mr. Horton said, asked and answered.
Mr. Skirek said, well, we're just clarifying.
The court said, asked and answered. Sustained.
All right. So again, in your experience, at your time at the exchange, you didn't see anything to suggest that people weren't working hard to try to bring merchants onto the platform, right?
Mr. Horton said, asked and answered, Your Honor.
The court said, sustained.
Now they didn't always succeed, right? That's right. Okay. And you believe that the team was spread a bit too thin, is that fair to say? The team was spread too thin. Yes. I'm not sure that was something that I would have said. I thought there was too many people. Okay. Well, let's see if we can refresh your recollection. Okay. Mr. Skirek said, bring up that same document. Just give me one moment.
The court said, the question is not whether the document says that. The question is whether the document refreshes your recollection that you said that.
The witness said, understood, Your Honor.
Mr. Skirek said, okay. Thank you. So can we please publish only for the parties, the court, and the witness? The document. And if we could blow it up and just highlight the relevant portion, please.
By Mr. Skirek.
Do you see that, Mr. Brown? Yes, I do. Okay. Now I'm going to show you another excerpt here. Just give us 1 second. Okay. Thanks for your patience. I think we have it now. Mr. Brown, this is the same document but a different entry. Just for your context.
Mr. Horton said, sorry. Is there a question pending?
The court said, the document is up. I think the question is whether this refreshes his recollection.
Mr. Skirek said, yes. It does refresh it, but it's in the context of the tech team. Fair enough. I mean, I hadn't asked that question, but yes, I understand. The point was, as you told the government, you believed that the tech team was spread too thin, right? Early on, yes.
The court said, you said in the context of the tech team as opposed to what?
The witness said, the overall staff was bloated. So the marketing staff, other departments were top-heavy.
Okay. And the tech team was spread too thin. And they were biting off more than you thought they could chew by trying to build a whole ecosystem, right? Yes, yes. Okay. Now again. You didn't see anything in your time at the exchange to suggest that the tech team wasn't working in good faith to build out that ecosystem.
Mr. Horton said, asked and answered, Your Honor.
Mr. Skirek said, well, we're on the tech team now, Your Honor. I think it's a different question.
The court said, you can answer as to the tech team.
Could you repeat that one more time? Sure. So you didn't see anything at your time at the exchange that suggested that the tech team wasn't working as hard as it could to build out the ecosystem. Right. That's correct. That's correct. Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, if it makes sense to the court, I think before I move on to another topic, it might be a good time.
The court said, all righty. It's 2:29. We'll take our break now and return at 3 o'clock. Remember, don't discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Don't permit anyone to discuss the case in your presence. Don't read, watch, or listen to anything from any source that touches on the subject matter of this case. Sir, you may step out of the courtroom. Don't discuss your testimony.
Jury not present. Witness not present.
The court said, "Is there anything before we have our break?"
Mr. Horton said, "Just a brief housekeeping issue, Your Honor. It would be helpful to know, for witness scheduling purposes, if the defense has an estimate for how long the rest of the cross is going to last."
The court said, "How long the cross will last?"
Mr. Horton said, "That's right."
Mr. Skirrick said, "Your Honor, my best estimate at this point is maybe another 45 minutes.
The court said, "All righty. See you later."
Recess.